In the dimly lit chambers of the Palazzo Medici, a young merchant named Lorenzo found himself facing ruin. His family's trading empire, built over 3 generations, crumbled beneath the weight of political intrigue and economic warfare waged by rival houses. As creditors circled like vultures and former allies turned their backs, Lorenzo discovered a worn manuscript hidden in his grandfather's study, Niccolò Machiavelli's private notes on power, not as it appears to the world, but as it truly exists within the human soul. The opening passage struck him like lightning. The greatest fortress a man can possess is not built of stone and mortar, but of an unshakable understanding of his own nature. He who masters himself becomes untouchable by the schemes of lesser men. Lorenzo's story mirrors that of countless individuals throughout history who have faced moments of profound crisis, only to discover that their greatest enemy was not external opposition, but the weak, reactive self that had governed their decisions. The path to true power, Machiavelli understood, begins not with the conquest of territories or the accumulation of wealth, but with the deliberate destruction of one's weaker nature. Consider the psychological landscape that most people inhabit, a terrain dominated by fear, insecurity, and the desperate need for approval from others. This weak self operates from a position of scarcity, always reacting to external circumstances rather than creating them. It seeks validation from sources beyond its control and crumbles when that validation is withdrawn. It makes decisions based on what others might think rather than what strategic wisdom demands. Most crucially, it believes that power comes from external sources, money, position, recognition, rather than from the unassailable fortress of inner authority. The weak self is characterized by several fatal flaws that make it vulnerable to manipulation and defeat. First, it operates from emotion rather than calculation. When faced with insult or setback, it responds with anger or despair rather than strategic thinking. Second, it seeks immediate gratification over long-term advantage, choosing short-term comfort over the difficult work of building genuine strength. Third, it requires constant external validation to maintain its sense of worth, making it dependent on the opinions and actions of others. Finally, it fears loss more than it desires victory, leading to defensive, reactive behavior that ensures mediocrity. The transformation from weak self to sovereign self requires a fundamental shift in perspective that Machiavelli termed the adoption of the king's mind. This is not about becoming tyrannical or ruthless, but about developing the mental framework that allows one to operate from a position of inner authority rather than external dependence. The king's mind recognizes that true power is psychological, not positional. It understands that perception often matters more than reality, and that the person who controls their own narrative cannot be controlled by others. Lorenzo's grandfather had understood this principle intimately. Despite facing numerous business reversals and political upheavals throughout his career, he had never allowed external circumstances to dictate his internal state. His journal, discovered alongside the Machiavelli manuscript, revealed a man who had systematically destroyed his own weaknesses through deliberate practice and philosophical discipline. Each morning, one entry read, "I examine my fears and dependencies like a surgeon examining a patient. What am I afraid to lose today? What approval do I seek? What comfort am I unwilling to sacrifice? These are the enemies within that must be eliminated if I am to remain free." The process of adopting the king's mind begins with brutal self-honesty about one's current psychological state. Most people live in elaborate self-deceptions, believing themselves to be stronger, more independent, and more rational than they actually are. They tell themselves they don't care what others think while carefully monitoring social media for validation. They claim to be focused on long-term goals while consistently choosing short-term pleasures. They profess confidence while being devastated by criticism or setbacks. True psychological sovereignty requires the courage to see oneself clearly, without the flattering filters of ego protection. This means acknowledging every fear, every dependency, every emotional trigger that gives others power over one's internal state. It means recognizing the ways in which the weak self has sabotaged previous efforts at growth and success. Most importantly, it means accepting full responsibility for one's current circumstances, regardless of how unfair or unfortunate they might seem. The ancient Stoic philosophers, whom Machiavelli studied extensively, understood this principle as the dichotomy of control. they recognized that human suffering and powerlessness stem primarily from attempting to control things that are inherently beyond our control: other people's opinions, external events, the passage of time, while neglecting the one thing that is entirely within our control: our own thoughts, attitudes, and responses. Marcus Aurelius, perhaps the most powerful man of his era, wrote in his personal journal, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." This was not the philosophy of a weak man seeking comfort, but the operational framework of someone who understood that external power without internal mastery is ultimately fragile and temporary. The weak self resists this truth because it threatens the comfortable illusion that our problems are primarily external and, therefore, not our responsibility to solve. It's easier to blame circumstances, other people, or bad luck than to acknowledge that our responses to these challenges are what ultimately determine our fate. The weak self prefers victimhood because victimhood requires no action, no change, no uncomfortable growth. But victimhood is the antithesis of sovereignty. The sovereign mind recognizes that even in the most challenging circumstances, there is always a choice in how to respond. This choice, between reactive weakness and strategic strength, is where true power resides. Viktor Frankl, surviving the horrors of Nazi concentration camps, discovered this truth in its most extreme form: everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. Lorenzo began his transformation by creating what he called a weakness inventory, a detailed examination of every way in which his emotional reactions, fears, and dependencies had contributed to his current crisis. He discovered that his need to be liked had led him to extend credit to unreliable partners. His fear of confrontation had prevented him from addressing problems early when they were still manageable. His desire to appear successful had caused him to overextend financially, creating the vulnerabilities that his enemies had exploited. This process of self-examination was painful but liberating. Each weakness identified became a target for elimination. Each dependency recognized became an opportunity for independence. Each fear acknowledged became a chance to develop courage. The weak self does not disappear overnight, but, through consistent, deliberate effort, it can be gradually replaced by something far more powerful. The first principle of adopting the king's mind is the recognition that perception is reality in human affairs. People respond not to who you actually are, but to who they believe you to be. The weak self focuses obsessively on trying to change reality to match its desires. The sovereign mind understands that it's often more effective to shape perception to serve strategic goals. This doesn't mean being deceptive or manipulative in a malicious sense, but rather understanding that confidence, authority, and power are largely psychological phenomena. A person who projects strength and certainty will be treated as strong and certain, regardless of their internal doubts or external circumstances. Conversely, someone who projects weakness and uncertainty will be treated accordingly, no matter what their actual capabilities might be. Machiavelli observed that men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, for everyone can see and few can feel. Everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are. This insight forms the foundation of strategic self-presentation. The sovereign mind carefully controls the information it reveals and the impression it creates, not from vanity or insecurity, but from an understanding of how human psychology actually works. Lorenzo learned this lesson when dealing with his creditors. Initially, he had approached them from a position of obvious desperation, begging for extensions and revealing the full extent of his financial difficulties. This only encouraged them to press harder for immediate payment, sensing his weakness. When he shifted his approach, meeting with them calmly, presenting a structured repayment plan, and projecting confidence in his ability to recover, their attitude changed dramatically. The facts of his situation hadn't changed, but the perception of his capabilities had, and this made all the difference in the negotiations. The second principle is the cultivation of strategic patience. The weak self demands immediate results and becomes discouraged when change doesn't happen quickly. It seeks instant gratification and becomes frustrated with the slow pace of genuine transformation. The sovereign mind operates on longer time horizons, understanding that real power is built gradually through consistent, intelligent effort over extended periods. This patience is not passive waiting, but active preparation. While others are reacting emotionally to immediate circumstances, the sovereign mind is positioning itself for future opportunities. It uses periods of apparent setback or quiet to develop capabilities, build relationships, and create strategic advantages that will pay dividends later. It understands that the person who can maintain focus and direction while others are distracted by short-term concerns will ultimately prevail. Consider how Warren Buffett built his fortune not through dramatic, attention-grabbing moves, but through patient, systematic investing over decades. While others were swept up in market manias and panics, he maintained a long-term perspective that allowed him to see opportunities where others saw only problems. His famous advice to be fearful when others are greedy and greedy when others are fearful reflects the sovereign mindset, the ability to maintain independent judgment regardless of crowd psychology. The third principle is the development of emotional independence. The weak self is emotionally reactive, allowing its internal state to be determined by external events and other people's behavior. The sovereign mind maintains emotional equilibrium regardless of circumstances, drawing its sense of worth and direction from internal sources rather than external validation. This doesn't mean becoming emotionally numb or disconnected, but rather developing the capacity to experience emotions without being controlled by them. Anger, fear, sadness, and joy are all valuable sources of information about our environment and relationships, but they become destructive when they drive our decisions instead of informing them. The practice of emotional independence requires developing what psychologists call distress tolerance, the ability to experience uncomfortable emotions without immediately acting to eliminate them. The weak self cannot tolerate discomfort and will make poor decisions to escape painful feelings. The sovereign mind can sit with discomfort long enough to determine the most strategic response. Lorenzo discovered this when his former business partner attempted to provoke him into a public confrontation that would have damaged both their reputations. The weak Lorenzo would have responded with immediate anger, defending his honor but playing into his adversary's hands. Instead, he recognized the manipulation attempt and chose not to engage, allowing his partner's behavior to speak for itself. This restraint ultimately worked in Lorenzo's favor, as others began to see the contrast between his measured response and his partner's emotional volatility. Part 2. The architecture of unshakable confidence. The transformation from weakness to sovereignty requires more than philosophical understanding, it demands the systematic construction of what can be called architectural confidence. This is not the brittle, performative confidence of the insecure, but the deep, structural confidence that comes from having systematically eliminated dependencies and built genuine capabilities. Like a master architect designing a fortress, the sovereign mind constructs its confidence on foundations that cannot be easily undermined by external forces. True confidence is never about feeling certain or comfortable all the time. It is about having developed the systems, skills, and mental frameworks that allow one to navigate uncertainty with composure and effectiveness. The weak self seeks confidence through external validation and favorable circumstances. The sovereign mind builds confidence through competence, preparation, and the knowledge that it can handle whatever challenges arise. Lorenzo's journey into architectural confidence began with what he termed capability building, the systematic development of skills and knowledge that would make him truly independent of others' goodwill or favorable circumstances. He realized that his previous confidence had been largely dependent on his family's established business relationships and reputation. When these external supports were stripped away, he discovered how little genuine capability he had developed on his own. The first component of architectural confidence is intellectual sovereignty, the development of independent thinking and judgment. Most people operate with borrowed opinions, accepting the conventional wisdom of their social group without serious examination. They think what they are supposed to think rather than what evidence and logic suggest they should think. This intellectual dependency makes them vulnerable to manipulation and leaves them without reliable guidance when conventional wisdom proves inadequate. Intellectual sovereignty requires the courage to examine one's own beliefs and assumptions with the same skepticism one applies to others. It means being willing to change one's mind when presented with better evidence or reasoning, even when this change is socially uncomfortable or personally inconvenient. Most importantly, it means developing the ability to think through complex problems independently rather than relying on others to provide ready-made solutions. Machiavelli himself exemplified this intellectual independence. Writing during a time when political thought was dominated by religious and idealistic frameworks, he had the audacity to examine power as it actually operated rather than as moral philosophers thought it should operate. This willingness to see things clearly, regardless of how uncomfortable the truth might be, gave his insights a penetrating accuracy that conventional thinkers could not match. Lorenzo began developing intellectual sovereignty by questioning every assumption that had guided his business decisions. Why had he believed that personal relationships were more important than formal contracts? Why had he assumed that being generous and trusting would create loyalty in others? Why had he thought that his family's reputation would protect him from aggressive competition? This process was intellectually and emotionally challenging because it revealed how much of his previous success had been dependent on factors beyond his control. But it also revealed opportunities for building genuine strength. By understanding how he had been vulnerable, he could systematically eliminate those vulnerabilities and replace them with real capabilities. The second component of architectural confidence is emotional resilience, the capacity to maintain psychological stability and clear thinking under pressure. The weak self is emotionally fragile, easily thrown off balance by criticism, setbacks, or unexpected challenges. The sovereign mind has developed emotional shock absorbers that allow it to experience difficulties without being overwhelmed by them. Emotional resilience is not about suppressing emotions or pretending that setbacks don't matter. It's about developing the psychological infrastructure to process challenging experiences without being derailed by them. This includes practices like systematic self-reflection, stress management techniques, and the cultivation of perspective that allows one to see temporary setbacks within the context of longer-term goals. One of the most powerful tools for building emotional resilience is what Stoic philosophers called premeditatio malorum, the practice of mentally rehearsing potential difficulties before they occur. This is not pessimistic thinking, but practical preparation. By imagining how one would handle various challenging scenarios, the mind becomes familiar with the idea of difficulty and less likely to be overwhelmed when actual challenges arise. Lorenzo adopted this practice by spending time each morning considering what could go wrong during the day and how he would handle each possibility. Initially, this exercise increased his anxiety, but gradually it began to build his confidence. He realized that most potential problems had workable solutions if approached calmly and systematically. More importantly, he discovered that the anticipation of difficulty was often worse than the difficulty itself. The third component of architectural confidence is strategic capability, the development of practical skills and systems that allow one to create value and solve problems regardless of circumstances. The weak self relies on position, connections, or favorable conditions to get things done. The sovereign mind develops portable skills that retain their value across different contexts and situations. Strategic capability includes both hard skills, technical knowledge, analytical abilities, communication skills, and soft skills, the ability to build relationships, influence others, and navigate complex social dynamics. But, most importantly, it includes meta skills, the ability to learn quickly, adapt to new situations, and identify the underlying patterns that govern success in different contexts. The development of strategic capability requires what psychologists call deliberate practice, focused, systematic effort to improve specific abilities beyond their current level. This is different from simply doing one's job or going through familiar motions. It requires stepping outside one's comfort zone, seeking feedback, and continuously pushing the boundaries of current capability. Lorenzo embarked on an intensive program of skill development that included studying advanced financial analysis, learning negotiation techniques, and developing his understanding of market psychology. But, perhaps most importantly, he began studying people, how they made decisions, what motivated them, and how they could be influenced. He realized that his previous approach to business had been naively transactional, focusing on products and services rather than understanding the deeper human dynamics that drive all commerce. The fourth component of architectural confidence is resource independence, the systematic reduction of dependency on any single source of income, support, or validation. The weak self puts all its eggs in one basket, making itself vulnerable to the whims of employers, customers, or benefactors. The sovereign mind diversifies its sources of strength, ensuring that the loss of any single resource cannot create catastrophic damage. Resource independence is not just about financial diversification, though that is certainly important. It also includes social diversification, maintaining relationships across different groups and contexts, skill diversification, developing capabilities that are valuable in multiple industries or situations, and psychological diversification, not depending on any single source of meaning or self-worth. This principle extends to information sources as well. The weak self gets its understanding of reality from a narrow range of sources, often chosen to confirm existing beliefs rather than challenge them. The sovereign mind actively seeks diverse perspectives, understanding that no single source of information provides a complete picture of complex situations. Lorenzo's previous business model had been dangerously concentrated. Most of his revenue came from a few large customers, all within the same industry, all subject to the same economic and political pressures. When that industry faced difficulties, his entire business collapsed. His reconstruction effort focused on building multiple revenue streams across different industries, reducing his vulnerability to any single market downturn. The fifth component of architectural confidence is systematic thinking, the ability to understand complex situations as interconnected systems rather than isolated events. The weak self thinks linearly and reactively, responding to immediate symptoms rather than addressing underlying causes. The sovereign mind thinks systematically, understanding how different elements of a situation influence each other and how changes in one area will ripple through the entire system. Systematic thinking allows one to identify leverage points, places where small changes can create large effects. It also helps one anticipate the unintended consequences of actions, avoiding the trap of solving one problem only to create two others. Most importantly, it provides the ability to see patterns and trends that are invisible to those focused only on immediate circumstances. Machiavelli demonstrated systematic thinking in his analysis of political power. Rather than focusing on individual rulers or specific events, he examined the underlying dynamics that determine political success across different contexts and time periods. This systematic approach allowed him to identify principles that remained valid regardless of specific circumstances. Lorenzo applied systematic thinking to his business reconstruction by mapping out all the factors that had contributed to his previous failure. He realized that his problems had not been caused by a single bad decision or unfortunate event, but by a pattern of choices that had created systemic vulnerabilities. By understanding these patterns, he could design a new approach that would be resistant to the same types of problems. The construction of architectural confidence requires patience and persistence because it cannot be built quickly or easily. Unlike the artificial confidence that comes from positive thinking or external validation, architectural confidence must be earned through actual accomplishment and genuine capability development. This process is often uncomfortable because it requires facing one's current limitations honestly and working systematically to overcome them. But the confidence that results from this process is unshakable because it is based on reality rather than illusion. The person who has systematically developed intellectual sovereignty, emotional resilience, strategic capability, resource independence, and systematic thinking cannot be easily intimidated or manipulated because their confidence comes from internal sources that others cannot control or take away. This transformation is visible in every aspect of how such a person operates. They speak with quiet authority because they know what they're talking about. They remain calm under pressure because they prepared for difficulties and developed the skills to handle them. They make decisions confidently because they've done the analytical work to understand the situation thoroughly. They're not defensive about criticism because their sense of worth doesn't depend on others' approval. Lorenzo's business associates noticed this change before he did. Where previously he had been eager to please and quick to defer to others' opinions, he now presented his views with calm conviction. Where he had once been anxious about potential problems, he now discussed challenges as manageable obstacles rather than existential threats. Where he had previously sought validation for his decisions, he now simply explained his reasoning and allowed others to form their own judgments. This shift in presence and demeanor had practical consequences. People began to treat Lorenzo differently, with more respect, more attention to his opinions, and more willingness to follow his lead. They sensed his increased confidence and competence, even if they couldn't articulate exactly what had changed. This created a positive feedback loop where his increased effectiveness reinforced his confidence, which in turn increased his effectiveness. Part 3, the practice of absolute inner authority. The final stage of adopting the king's mind transcends the elimination of weakness and the construction of confidence to achieve what can only be described as absolute inner authority, a state of psychological sovereignty so complete that external circumstances lose their power to dictate one's internal experience. This is not detachment or indifference, but rather a profound engagement with life from a position of unassailable inner strength. Absolute inner authority represents the full flowering of Machiavelli's insight that true power is psychological rather than positional. The person who achieves this state becomes genuinely untouchable not because they are invulnerable to external challenges, but because they have developed the internal resources to transform any challenge into an opportunity for further growth and strategic advantage. Lorenzo's final transformation began during what appeared to be his greatest triumph. His business reconstruction had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. He had not only recovered his family's lost wealth but had built something far more robust and diversified than what had existed before. His reputation for intelligence and integrity had been restored, and influential people sought his counsel on complex business matters. By every external measure, he had achieved complete success. Yet Lorenzo found himself experiencing a subtle but persistent dissatisfaction. Despite his accomplishments, he realized that he was still operating from a fundamentally reactive position, responding to market conditions, client demands, and competitive pressures rather than truly shaping his environment according to his own vision. He had become very skilled at playing the game as it existed, but he had not yet learned to change the rules of the game itself. This realization led him to the deepest level of Machiavelli's teaching, the understanding that ultimate power comes not from adapting to reality, but from shaping reality according to one's own vision and values. The weak self accepts the world as it finds it, trying to find a comfortable niche within existing structures. The sovereign mind recognizes that reality is far more malleable than most people believe, and that those with sufficient clarity and determination can reshape circumstances according to their own design. Absolute inner authority begins with the recognition that most of what people accept as reality is actually consensus fiction, shared agreements about how things work that could, in principle, be changed if enough people decided to change them. Markets, institutions, social hierarchies, and even many apparent physical limitations are more flexible than they appear to those who have never tested their boundaries. This doesn't mean that objective reality doesn't exist or that everything is purely subjective. Rather, it means that within the constraints of natural law, there is enormous room for human creativity and will to shape circumstances. The person who understands this operates with a fundamentally different relationship to possibility than those who accept conventional limitations as absolute. The development of absolute inner authority requires what Machiavelli called virtù, a concept that combines moral excellence with practical effectiveness, strategic intelligence with courageous action. Virtù is not virtue in the modern sense of moral righteousness, but rather the classical understanding of excellence that encompasses all human capabilities working in harmony toward worthy goals. A person with virtù does not merely react to circumstances or follow conventional pathways to success. Instead, they identify what they believe should exist in the world and, then, work systematically to bring it into being, regardless of current obstacles or the opinions of others. They operate from their own internal compass rather than external approval, and they maintain this direction even when facing significant resistance or setbacks. Lorenzo's expression of virtù began when he recognized that the business practices common in his industry were not only ethically questionable but also economically inefficient. Rather than simply conducting his own business more ethically while accepting the industry's corrupt standards, he began working to transform the entire sector's approach to client relationships and business partnerships. This was far more challenging than simply being successful within existing systems. It required him to create new standards, educate clients and competitors about better approaches, and sometimes sacrifice short-term profits for long-term transformation. Many people told him he was naive or idealistic, but Lorenzo had developed sufficient inner authority to pursue his vision regardless of such criticism. The practice of absolute inner authority requires the cultivation of what can be called sovereign perception, the ability to see situations from multiple perspectives simultaneously while maintaining clarity about one's own values and objectives. Most people are trapped in a single perspective, usually their own immediate self-interest, which limits their ability to understand complex situations or find creative solutions to difficult problems. Sovereign perception allows one to understand how different parties view a situation, what motivates their behavior, and how various interests might be aligned in mutually beneficial ways. This is not manipulative calculation, but rather a generous understanding that recognizes the legitimate needs and concerns of all stakeholders while maintaining clarity about one's own principles and goals. This expanded perspective enables what Machiavelli recognized as one of the highest forms of power, the ability to create situations where doing what serves your interests also serves the interests of others. Rather than viewing power as a zero-sum competition where one person's gain requires another's loss, sovereign perception reveals opportunities for what we might call positive-sum power influence that creates value for everyone involved. Lorenzo demonstrated this when he restructured a major business negotiation that had reached an apparent impasse. Rather than continuing to argue for his position against the other party's position, he stepped back and analyzed the underlying interests that both sides were trying to serve. He then designed a completely different arrangement that met both parties' core needs in ways that neither had initially considered possible. This approach not only resolved the immediate conflict but established Lorenzo as someone who could find solutions where others saw only problems. The development of sovereign perception requires systematic practice in what psychologists call perspective taking, the deliberate effort to understand situations from viewpoints other than one's own. This is difficult because human psychology naturally tends toward egocentric thinking, where we assume that others see things the way we do or that our own perspective is the most accurate or important one. Effective perspective taking requires both intellectual humility, the recognition that one's initial understanding of any situation is likely incomplete, and emotional security, the confidence to consider viewpoints that might challenge one's own preferences or assumptions. It also requires genuine curiosity about other people's experiences and motivations rather than merely trying to predict their behavior for strategic purposes. The second key element of absolute inner authority is what can be termed creative destruction, the willingness to systematically eliminate anything in one's life or approach that no longer serves one's highest goals, regardless of how comfortable, familiar, or apparently successful it might be. This includes outdated beliefs, ineffective habits, limiting relationships, and even successful but ultimately unsatisfying achievements. Creative destruction is perhaps the most challenging aspect of developing inner authority because it requires giving up known benefits for unknown possibilities. The weak self clings to whatever security it has achieved, even when that security prevents further growth. The sovereign mind recognizes that true security comes from one's capacity to create value and solve problems, not from any particular set of circumstances or possessions. This principle extends beyond material possessions to include psychological attachments that limit growth and effectiveness. Many people remain stuck in patterns of thinking and behavior that once served them well but have become obstacles to their current development. The person with absolute inner authority regularly examines all aspects of their life and approach, asking not what do I want to keep, but what serves my highest vision for who I am becoming. Lorenzo practiced creative destruction when he realized that some of his most profitable business relationships were also the most constraining ones. These clients paid well but demanded so much time and energy that they prevented him from pursuing more meaningful and ultimately more valuable opportunities. Ending these relationships required significant short-term sacrifice but opened space for developing the kind of business he actually wanted to build. The third element of absolute inner authority is visionary leadership, the ability to see possibilities that others cannot see and to inspire coordinated action toward goals that transcend individual self-interest. This is not about charisma or persuasion techniques, but about developing such clarity about worthwhile goals and effective methods that others naturally want to participate in bringing the vision to reality. Visionary leadership requires what the ancient Greeks called phronesis, practical wisdom that combines ethical understanding with strategic intelligence. It's the ability to see not just what could be done, but what should be done given all the relevant factors and constraints. This includes understanding the long-term consequences of actions, the unintended effects of well-intentioned interventions, and the difference between what appears beneficial and what actually creates lasting value. The person who develops genuine visionary leadership becomes a natural focal point for others who are seeking meaning and direction in their own lives. They don't need to convince or manipulate people to follow their lead because their vision addresses real needs and their methods prove effective in practice. Others are drawn to them not out of personal loyalty or charismatic attraction, but because they represent a credible path toward goals that matter. Lorenzo's visionary leadership emerged when he began organizing other business leaders around the concept of principled commerce, business practices that created value for all stakeholders rather than extracting maximum profit for shareholders alone. This was not altruistic idealism but practical intelligence, based on his observation that businesses built on mutual benefit were more sustainable and, ultimately, more profitable than those based on zero-sum competition. The fourth element of absolute inner authority is strategic patience, the ability to maintain focus on long-term goals while remaining fully engaged with immediate circumstances. This is different from mere waiting or procrastination. It's an active process of positioning oneself for future opportunities while handling current responsibilities with excellence. Strategic patience requires tremendous psychological discipline because human psychology naturally tends toward either immediate gratification or anxious rumination about the future. The person with absolute inner authority has learned to be fully present in each moment while maintaining awareness of how current actions serve longer-term objectives. They neither sacrifice the future for immediate pleasure nor sacrifice present effectiveness for abstract future goals. This capacity allows them to make decisions and take actions that others cannot understand or appreciate because the benefits may not be visible for years or even decades. They can invest time and resources in developing capabilities that have no immediate payoff but will be crucial for future challenges. They can maintain relationships and honor commitments even when there's no apparent immediate benefit because they understand the long-term value of integrity and reliability. Lorenzo demonstrated strategic patience when he spent 2 years developing relationships with emerging leaders in adjacent industries, despite having no clear idea how these connections might prove valuable. When a major opportunity arose requiring expertise and partnerships outside his traditional field, these relationships proved crucial in allowing him to compete successfully against much larger competitors who lacked his network. The fifth and final element of absolute inner authority is what might be called philosophical sovereignty, the development of one's own coherent understanding of what makes life meaningful and worthwhile, independent of social conventions or external authorities. This is not narcissistic individualism but, rather, the mature recognition that each person must ultimately take responsibility for their own values and choices. Philosophical sovereignty requires grappling seriously with fundamental questions. What is the purpose of human existence? What constitutes a life well lived? What responsibilities do we have to others and to future generations? What is the relationship between personal fulfillment and social contribution? These are not academic questions but practical ones that determine how one approaches every significant decision. The person who achieves philosophical sovereignty operates from their own internal authority rather than seeking guidance from external sources. They may learn from others and respect various traditions of wisdom, but their ultimate allegiance is to their own carefully considered understanding of truth and value. This gives them a stability and consistency that allows others to predict their behavior and trust their commitments. Lorenzo's philosophical sovereignty crystallized around the principle that genuine prosperity could only be sustainable if it benefited the entire community rather than being extracted from it. This was not a moral platitude but a practical insight based on his observation of which businesses and communities thrived over long periods and which eventually collapsed under the weight of their own contradictions. The achievement of absolute inner authority represents the complete fulfillment of Machiavelli's vision of human potential. The person who reaches this state has become truly untouchable not because they are invulnerable to external challenges, but because they have developed the internal resources to transform any challenge into an opportunity for further growth and contribution. They have eliminated dependency on external validation, reduced their vulnerability to manipulation or coercion, and developed the capability to shape circumstances according to their own vision and values. This transformation is visible in every aspect of how such a person operates in the world. They speak with quiet authority because their words are backed by genuine understanding and capability. They remain calm in crisis because they have developed the resources to handle whatever arises. They make decisions confidently because they have done the difficult work of clarifying their values and understanding the consequences of different choices. They are generous with others because their own security is internally sourced rather than dependent on hoarding external resources. Most importantly, they become a source of strength and inspiration for others who are still struggling with their own weaknesses and limitations. Not through preaching or trying to convince others, but simply through the example of what becomes possible when someone commits fully to their own development and refuses to accept limitations that are not actually necessary. Lorenzo's final realization came when he understood that his greatest achievement was not the business empire he had built or the wealth he had accumulated, but the person he had become in the process. The external successes were simply natural expressions of the internal transformation he had undergone. He had destroyed his weak self so thoroughly that it could never be resurrected, and, in its place, had built something that no external force could touch or diminish. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because there is nothing weak left to destroy. He has become like water, apparently soft and yielding, but capable of wearing down the hardest stone through patient persistence. He has achieved what Lao Tzu called Wu Wei, effortless action that accomplishes great things without strain or struggle. He has become what Marcus Aurelius described as like the rocky headland on which the waves constantly break. It stands firm, and round it the seething waters are laid to rest. This is the ultimate meaning of adopting the king's mind, not to become a ruler of others, but to become the undisputed sovereign of one's own inner realm. From this position of absolute inner authority, all external achievements become possible, but, more importantly, they become expressions of something far more valuable than mere success. They become expressions of human potential fully realized and freely given in service to the larger good. The journey from weakness to sovereignty is available to anyone willing to undertake the difficult work of systematic self-transformation. It requires no special talent or favorable circumstances, only the courage to see oneself clearly, the discipline to eliminate what doesn't serve, and the persistence to build something better in its place. The destination is worth any sacrifice required to reach it, the unshakable knowledge that one has become truly free.